Dead Heat at Brands Patch Part 1, Engines and Aftermath. The sound hit Finch first. It wasn't the roar, or he'd expected that. It was the way the noise ended. One moment the air above Brands Hatch was alive with engines tearing at themselves, the crowd leaning forward as one organism, breath held between gears. The next, there was a single, hollow crack, metal failing at speed, and then a silence so abrupt it felt unnatural. Silence never came honestly at places like this. Finch stood just behind the barrier, coat buttoned against a wind that smelled of petrol and wet grass. He'd arrived 20 minutes earlier, summoned quietly, without ceremony. No sirens. No uniforms on display. Just a phone call that said something's wrong in a voice that had learned how not to say more than it should. The car lay on its side at the edge of the track, nose folded inward like a collapsed lung. Smoke curled lazily upward, embarrassed now that the show was over. Marshals moved with rehearsed urgency, but Finch noticed the hesitation, the fraction of a second when everyone understood this wasn't one of the survivable ones. A man lay still inside the wreck. They pulled him free with care that came too late. Finch watched from a distance as the medics shook their heads, subtle but final. The crowd didn't know yet. Or pretended not to. People still talked. Still laughed. Somewhere, a vendor sold tea as if nothing irreversible had just occurred. That, Finch thought, was the most disturbing thing of all. The victim's name was Graham Hales. 36. Privateer. Good enough to be dangerous, not good enough to be protected. Finch learned this from the circuit official who walked beside him, a man in a windbreaker with the track's logo stitched neatly over his heart. Brake failure, the official said. Tragic, but it happens. Does it? Finch asked mildly. The man hesitated. At speed, under pressure, yes. Finch crouched near the wreckage, ignoring the way the wind cut through his trousers. The smell of burnt rubber and oil clung to everything. He didn't touch the car, but he looked. Closely. Too closely for comfort. Has the vehicle been moved? Finch asked. Only to extract the driver. And before the crash. What do you mean? Any complaints? Finch said. Handling. Pull. Resistance. The official frowned. You think this wasn't an accident? Finch straightened slowly. I think it was expensive. That earned him a look. Finch gestured toward the twisted front assembly. That line there, see how clean it sheared. The official swallowed. I'm not an engineer. No, Finch agreed. But someone was. They took him to a temporary office overlooking the paddock. From there, Finch could see everything, the cars being towed away, the mechanics already working on something else, the quiet efficiency with which tragedy was absorbed into schedule. A young constable handed Finch a cup of tea that tasted like it had been made out of obligation rather than care. Sir, the constable said, lowering his voice, the race organizers would prefer we call this accidental. For now. Finch looked out at the track. At the curve where Hales had died. For now, he repeated. The constable hesitated. There's betting involved. Of course there was. How much? Finch asked. Enough. Finch nodded. He had seen this shape before. Different setting. Same pressure. Truth weighed against convenience. Outside, an engine started up again. A test run. The sound tore across the track, loud and thrilling and entirely indifferent to the man who would never hear it again. Finch closed his notebook. This wasn't just about speed. It was about what happened when too many people needed someone to lose, and one man refused to do it properly. And somewhere in that refusal, someone had made sure the race ended early. For Graham Hales. And, Finch suspected, for more than just him. Part 2, the paddock. By the time Finch stepped into the paddock, the noise had returned, but it was different now. Engines still barked and coughed into life, but the laughter had thinned. Conversations happened in tight clusters, voices lowered, eyes glancing sideways as if death were something contagious. Graham Hales had been moved off the track, but his absence lingered like a smell that wouldn't clear. Finch walked slowly, hands in his coat pockets, letting people see him before they realized what he was. He'd learned early in his career that announcing yourself too loudly made liars better at their jobs. A mechanic spotted him and stiffened. Another looked away. Good, Finch thought. That meant they knew. He stopped beside a modest transport van with peeling paint and a hand-lettered name on the side, Hales Racing. No corporate sponsor. No polish. Just grit and ambition, neither of which aged particularly well in places like this. A woman sat on a folding chair nearby, cigarette burning forgotten between her fingers. She looked up as Finch approached, eyes red but steady. Grief had settled into her the way fatigue did, remembered too often to surprise anymore. Mrs. Hales? Finch asked. She nodded once. Yes. I'm Detective Inspector Finch. I know, she said. You're the one they didn't want. That earned her a nod in return. May I sit? Finch asked. She gestured vaguely toward an overturned crate. My husband told me this would happen, she said, before Finch could ask anything at all. He waited. Silence, used properly, was an invitation. They said his car wasn't competitive, she continued. That he was a risk. That he drove like he had something to prove. And did he? Finch asked. She exhaled smoke slowly. Don't we all? Across the paddock, Finch noticed a man watching them. Tall. Expensively casual. Sunglasses despite the overcast sky. The sort of man who wore confidence like a tailored jacket. That one. Finch asked quietly, without looking. Mrs. Hales followed his gaze. Her mouth tightened. That's Arthur Bell. Driver. Bookmaker, she said. Or something like one. Bell turned away the moment Finch's eyes met his. Finch filed the name away. He spoke next to Colin Mercer, Hale's chief mechanic, a man with oil permanently embedded into the lines of his hands. Mercer's voice shook when he spoke, but not from grief alone. I checked that car myself, Mercer said. Every bolt. Every line. Before the race, Finch said. Yes. And after? Finch asked. Mercer looked up sharply. After what? After someone leaned on you, Finch said calmly. Mercer's jaw clenched. You've no proof of that. No, Finch agreed. But I've a good sense for fear. Mercer turned away. We all look scared today. That's not what I mean, Finch said. Mercer swallowed. There are people who don't like surprises. And your driver surprised them. Mercer's shoulders sagged, just a fraction. Graham was meant to place. Middle of the pack. Safe. Instead. Finch prompted. He was running hot, Mercer said. Too hot. He wanted more. Finch nodded. And someone made sure he got it. Later, Finch wandered past the sponsor tents, temporary structures pretending to be permanent power. Names Finch recognized only vaguely. Money without faces. Faces without accountability. He stopped at one tent where a young driver laughed too loudly, his arm slung around a woman in mirrored sunglasses. Enjoying the day? Finch asked him. The man squinted. You a fan? No, Finch said. I'm a policeman. The smile vanished. Did you know Graham Hales? Finch asked. Everyone knows everyone, the driver said carefully. Did you bet against him? The driver bristled. I don't gamble. Finch leaned closer. You race. The man flushed. As Finch stepped away, he felt it again, that familiar tightening at the base of his skull. The sense that he was standing inside a system designed to absorb casualties without acknowledging them. He thought briefly of his flat. Of its narrow windows and unreliable heat. Of the echo left by a woman who no longer lived there. Risk, he thought, was always easier when someone else paid for it. Finch looked once more toward the track, now cleared, now ready. Someone would race again. Someone always did. And somewhere between the engines and the money, someone had decided Graham Hales was expendable. Finch intended to find out who. Part 3, Odds and Leverage. Finch had learned long ago that crime rarely announced itself as crime. Most of the time it wore the clothes of commerce. The betting shop sat just outside the circuit grounds, close enough to feel legitimate, far enough to deny responsibility. Its windows were fogged with cigarette smoke and expectation. Inside, men stood shoulder to shoulder, watching flickering screens, lives and livelihoods measured in fractions of a second. Finch entered quietly. A bell chimed overhead, the sound too cheerful for the place. Conversations dipped, then resumed with exaggerated casualness. Behind the counter stood Arthur Bell. He recognized Finch immediately. "Well," Bell said, spreading his hands. "If it isn't the law." "Afternoon," Finch replied. "Busy day." Bell smiled thinly. "Racing tends to do that." Graham Hales was a popular bet, Finch said. Bell's eyes flicked to the screens. "Depends which way you backed him." "And which way did you?" Finch asked. Bell laughed. "I don't bet. I set the odds. Then you profit either way." "Usually," Bell said. Finch leaned in. "Except when someone doesn't follow the script." The smile froze. Bell led Finch into a back room that smelled of stale coffee and caution. "You're implying sabotage," Bell said. "I'm implying pressure," Finch replied. "Sabotage is what happens when pressure turns into panic." Bell exhaled. "You've no proof." "Not yet," Finch said. "But someone adjusted the odds sharply this morning." "Against Hales." Bell's fingers drummed the desk. "Information moves quickly." "Information moves deliberately," Finch corrected. "Someone knew." Bell stood. "Even if that were true, this isn't a police matter." "Someone died," Finch said. Bell's voice hardened. "Men die racing every week." Finch looked at him. "Not like this." Outside, Finch spotted a familiar figure leaning against a lamppost, leather jacket zipped halfway up, cigarette glowing defiantly. Cindy Lawless. She grinned when she saw him. "You look lost." "You look predictable," Finch said. "Careful," she replied. That almost sounded fond. They walked together, the noise of the circuit receding. "You sniffing around the bookies?" Cindy asked. "Yes." "Good," she said. "Because they're sniffing around you." Finch stopped. "What do you know?" Cindy flicked ash into the gutter. "Word is someone paid to make sure Hales didn't win." "And instead?" Finch said. "He didn't finish," Cindy said quietly. She told Finch about the syndicate, men who never appeared at races, who treated drivers like numbers and accidents like rounding errors. She spoke fast, reckless as ever, but Finch caught the fear beneath it. "You shouldn't be involved," Finch said. Cindy shrugged. "Someone has to be." Finch watched her disappear into the crowd. Impulsive. Brave. Dangerous. Everything he wasn't allowed to be. But everything this case might need. Finch looked back toward the track, the betting shop, the tangled lines of money and metal. The odds, he realized, were being adjusted even now. And someone was about to lose again. Part 4, The Line That Snaps. Finch didn't go back to the circuit right away. Instead, he drove. The roads around Kent unwound beneath the car in long, damp ribbons, hedgerows blurring at the edges of his vision. He needed distance, space for the shape of the thing to make itself clear. Racing was built on the illusion of control. So was betting. So was the law, when it pretended not to notice who it served best. By the time Finch pulled into a lay-by overlooking the Thames estuary, he knew what had happened. Graham Hales hadn't been meant to die. He'd been meant to lose. A brake line loosened just enough to shave seconds. A missed apex. A respectable failure. The kind that paid out cleanly and quietly. But Hales had pushed anyway. He'd driven like a man who refused to accept the role written for him. And someone, somewhere, had miscalculated. Finch crushed out a cigarette he didn't remember lighting and headed back. The paddock was tighter now. Word had spread, not officially, but in the way people leaned closer when they spoke, in the way mechanics watched Finch from under brows heavy with grease and resentment. The racing continued, but the joy had drained out of it, leaving only noise and obligation. Finch found Colin Mercer again, crouched beside a stripped-down engine, hands shaking as he worked. "Did you touch the brake line?" Finch asked without preamble. Mercer froze. "No," he said too quickly. "Did anyone else?" Finch pressed. Mercer swallowed. "A man came by early. Said he was from the organizers. Had papers. Did he show them?" Finch asked. Mercer shook his head. "Didn't think to ask." Finch closed his eyes briefly. That was how it always happened. Authority borrowed just long enough to do damage. "Can you describe him?" Finch asked. Mercer hesitated. Then, quietly, "I don't want this following me." "It already is," Finch said. The description matched a man Finch had seen before, not at the circuit, but in the betting shop. A courier type. Forgettable by design. Finch took it to his superiors. They listened. They nodded. They asked the right questions in the wrong order. "Betting syndicates are delicate," one of them said carefully. "We don't want to overreach." Finch stared at the desk between them. "A man was killed." "Yes," the superintendent replied. "And we'll charge someone. Eventually." Finch understood then exactly how far this would be allowed to go. He left without arguing. There was no point. That evening, Cindy Lawless found him again, this time outside a greasy cafe that pretended it didn't serve after dark. "You look like you lost," she said. "I did," Finch replied. "Just not the way they expected." She slid into the seat across from him. "There's a man leaving tonight. Courier. Heading north." Finch stiffened. "How do you know?" "Because he's scared," Cindy said. "And scared men move." Finch looked at her. At the certainty in her face. At the recklessness he both needed and despised. "This doesn't involve you," he said. She smiled thinly. Neither did the factory. The memory hit him harder than he expected. "Where?" Finch asked. "Service Road off the A2, Cindy said. "Half an hour." Finch stood. That was the line. And he stepped over it. They found the man exactly where Cindy said they would, standing beside a car with its boot open, rain slicking down his coat, panic etched into the way he kept looking over his shoulder. Finch approached slowly, badge raised. The man bolted. He didn't get far. Pinned between car and barrier, he talked. Not heroically. Not completely. But enough. Enough to name the syndicate. Enough to describe the instruction. Enough to confirm what Finch already knew. He wasn't meant to crash, the man sobbed. "Just slow down." Finch listened in silence. When it was over, he let the man go. Not officially. But deliberately. Later, alone in his flat, Finch wrote everything down. Names. Methods. Motives. He knew most of it would never see daylight. But some of it would. Enough to stop this particular machine from running smoothly ever again. Outside, somewhere, engines screamed into the night. Inside, Finch sat very still, knowing this case, like the one before it, would leave its mark. One more lesson learned at speed. One more line snapped clean through. Part 5, what the track remembers the boy had been there all along. Finch realized this only later, how often he'd passed him without truly seeing him. A thin figure at the fence line. A flash of movement near the paddock. Someone too young to belong, too familiar to question. He noticed him properly for the first time 3 days after the crash. The rain had settled into that particular London persistence, no downpour, no drama, just enough to keep everything damp and uncomfortable. Finch stood near the edge of the circuit, notebook closed, watching a group of mechanics strip an engine with practiced indifference. The boy stood on the other side of the chain-link fence. He couldn't have been more than 15. 16 at most. Cap pulled low, jacket too big, hands shoved deep into his pockets. He watched everything with an intensity that bordered on reverence. "You going to charge admission for that stare?" Finch asked mildly. The boy startled, then recovered quickly. "Didn't know it was private." "It isn't," Finch said. "But it's educational to announce yourself." The boy considered this. "You're the copper." "I am," Finch agreed. "The one asking the wrong questions," the boy added. That was enough to interest Finch. "What questions would you recommend?" he asked. The boy shrugged. "Depends what you want to know." Finch studied him. "No bravado?" "No fear, either. Just certainty." "What's your name?" Finch asked. "Eddie," the boy said after a pause. "Eddie Pike." "And what do you do here, Eddie Pike?" "I watch," Eddie replied. "People don't mind if you don't talk." Finch smiled faintly. "People mind very much. They're just bad at noticing." They walked along the fence line together. Eddie spoke in fragments at first, about engines, about the difference between drivers who raced and drivers who performed, about the way money changed hands without ever being seen. Finch let him talk. This wasn't an interrogation. It was an invitation. He didn't want to lose, Eddie said suddenly. Finch stopped. "Who?" "Hales," Eddie replied. "Everyone said he did. But he didn't." Finch kept his voice neutral. "What makes you think that?" "I heard him," Eddie said. "Arguing?" "With whom?" Finch asked carefully. Eddie hesitated. "Then, not the man you're looking for." That landed. "Try me," Finch said. It came out slowly. Hales had known about the pressure. About the money. About the expectations. He'd agreed to shave time, not throw the race outright. Enough to keep the syndicate satisfied. Enough to keep his seat. But then something changed, Eddie said. "When?" Finch asked. "Morning of the race," Eddie replied. Another man came by. "Description?" Finch asked. Eddie shook his head. Didn't matter. Hales didn't know him. What did he do? Touched the car, Eddie said simply. Not like a mechanic. Like a thief. Finch closed his eyes briefly. And Hales, he asked. He argued, Eddie said. Said that wasn't the deal. Finch felt the weight of it settle into place. Did you tell anyone? Finch asked. Eddie snorted. Who listens to kids? Finch didn't answer that. He didn't have a defense. The truth, when it finally emerged, was uglier than Finch had hoped. The syndicate hadn't ordered Hale's death. They'd ordered compliance. But systems built on fear eventually attract people eager to improve efficiency. Someone had tightened the brake line beyond instruction. Someone had decided a crash would be cleaner than a risk. And when Hales realized it, he'd driven anyway. Not out of heroism. Out of defiance. He thought if he finished strong, they wouldn't dare, Eddie said. But they had already, Finch murmured. Finch faced a decision he'd been pretending not to see. Officially, the case was closed. Unofficially, this truth would go nowhere. The man who made the final adjustment would never be named. The syndicate would adapt. It always did. But Eddie Pike was standing in front of him, holding something fragile and dangerous. Did anyone else see this? Finch asked. Eddie shook his head. Just me. And if I ask you to say nothing? Finch asked quietly. Eddie met his eyes. I wasn't planning to talk anyway. That, more than anything, told Finch what kind of man the boy might become. That night, Finch returned to his flat. It felt smaller than usual. The walls too close. The silence too loud. He sat at the small table, a single bulb casting harsh light over his notebook. He wrote. Not everything. But enough. He left out Eddie's name. Altered a detail here, softened another there. He framed the death as an overreach by a nameless intermediary, true enough to stop questions, vague enough to bury responsibility. He hated himself for it. He did it anyway. Before leaving the circuit for the last time, Finch found Eddie again. "You should stop coming here," Finch said. Eddie shrugged. "It's all I know." "Then know something else," Finch said. He pressed a folded piece of paper into the boy's hand. "An address. A name. If you ever need work. Or help." Eddie stared at it. "Why?" Finch thought of his daughter. Of the ways he'd failed to notice when it mattered. "Because someone should have done it for me," Finch said. Eddie nodded once. Carefully. As if accepting something heavier than it looked. As Finch drove away, engines roared behind him, another race, another beginning. The track would remember. It always did. So would Finch. Some cases didn't end at the finish line. They just taught you where not to stand next time. Part 6, after the engines fade, the letter arrived on a Tuesday. Finch noticed it because it wasn't official, no crest, no return address, no institutional authority to hide behind. Just his name, written carefully, as if the writer were afraid of getting it wrong. He didn't open it right away. The kettle boiled dry before he remembered it, filling the flat with the smell of scorched metal. He turned off the stove, sat at the table, and finally slid a finger beneath the flap. It was from his daughter. Not long. Not apologetic. Not warm. She'd moved again. Manchester this time. A job that sounded temporary even as she described it. No invitation. No accusation. Just information, offered at arm's length. Finch folded the letter neatly and placed it back on the table. That, he thought, was how relationships ended these days, not with shouting, but with updates. The case file was officially closed by the end of the week. The wording was precise. Mechanical failure exacerbated by unauthorized interference. No suspects named. No charges filed. A conclusion that satisfied paperwork without satisfying anyone. Finch signed it anyway. He'd learned that justice wasn't always about winning. Sometimes it was about deciding what not to destroy in the process. On Sunday morning, Finch took a train back toward the outskirts of Kent. The circuit was quieter now. No crowds. No banners. Just the skeletal remains of spectacle, empty stands, tire marks fading like old arguments. He walked the perimeter fence alone. At the far bend, he spotted Eddie Pike. The boy stood with his back to the track, staring out toward the fields beyond, as if measuring the distance between where he'd been and where he might go. "You'll miss it," Finch said. Eddie turned. "I already do." Finch nodded. That's how you know it mattered. They stood in silence for a while. Did he suffer? Eddie asked suddenly. Finch answered honestly. Not long. Eddie absorbed that. Then they'll do it again. Yes, Finch said. Will you stop them? Finch looked at the empty track. At the place where control ended and consequence began. I'll slow them down, he said. That's sometimes the best you can do. Eddie smiled faintly. That's something. When Finch returned to London, the flat felt less hostile. Still small. Still lonely. But lived in. He poured a drink he didn't finish and sat by the window, listening to the city, sirens, laughter, engines in the distance. Life, indifferent and relentless. He thought of Graham Hales, pushing past his limit. Of Eddie, watching everything. Of a daughter who still wrote, even if she didn't visit. Somewhere between the law and the truth, Finch realized, was a narrow strip of ground where you could still stand without lying to yourself. He didn't know how long he'd stay there. But for now, it was enough. Outside, a car accelerated hard through the night. Finch closed the file. And the engines faded.